Because I would anything that was like unclear, weird, random questions, I'd love to speak about them. Yeah, great.
Dr. Kuhner, who did you say said the part about life of the disciple must be lived through the filial love for Mary?
Jean Galot, Jeangalot, a little-known Jesuit from earlier on in the 20th century. And he has written, in my opinion, one of the best books. It's called Mary in the Gospels. And this is a great chance for me to do a shameless plug, which I apologize for, but we have at St. Bernard's, Professor Lisa Lacona, who's on faculty at St. Bernard's, and I are going to be co-teaching a full course on Mary this spring, starting on January 8th. And we have a promotion going where you can actually audit, like sit in on that class from anywhere, via Zoom or in person, for $35. So it's much cheaper than usual. And we actually, the reason I mention that is because we actually read most of Gallot's book, which again is just a commentary on scripture, but from a Marian perspective. So thanks for the alley-oop there, that's helpful. But Jean Galot, he has a book that's published, a better known book by his that's called, I think it's called The Theology of the Priesthood, and it's published by Ignatius Press. So that's another access point for his work. But yeah, very controversial for the deacons and diaconate candidates in the room. He reads Acts of the Apostles not as Acts 6 or whatever with the 7 deacons. He reads, very controversially, that not as the first diaconate ordination, but as the first presbyterate ordination. And there's a huge back and forth in the 20th, he sort of like broke this argument in the 20th century, and so he's still a touchstone for that. So I don't really know what to think. I'm not an expert enough in that. But. Yeah, please.
Is there the tradition of devotion to the Blessed Mother in the Eastern Church?
Absolutely, and in some ways it even I would say transcends or eclipses the Western tradition in some ways in its intensity. Okay, and for them, one of the reasons is that the first controversies with Mary, if you remember really early on, there was this debate with this guy Nestorius who said that Mary is not the mother of God, but only the mother of Christ's humanity, but not actually the mother of Christ as God. Okay, so it's very confusing and too deep to go in, and I'm not even sure I could do it justice if I had all the time in the world, but they worship God in a very real sense through Mary as what they call the Theotokos, or the God-bearer, okay? And this comes out in a lot of their art and their hymns. So if you have a pen and you want to write something down, one of the most beautiful hymns to Mary comes actually from the East, and it's called the Akathist hymn, Akathist, the Akathist hymn. It is unbelievable. It's unbelievable. It's great to take to prayer. And they actually chant it, and it's part of their liturgies. If you've ever been to a Byzantine Catholic church or an Eastern Orthodox church, you know that they have what's called an iconostasis. It's a big wall in front of the altar covered with icons, and it's gilded, and it's just incredible. What's amazing is, think of Mary as monstrance, okay? Very frequently, on the 2 doors that open up to the altar to receive the Eucharist, typically there's an image of the Theotokos, Mary, on one of those doors. She is the access point to the Eucharist on the iconostasis. And it's very typically, if you look up in Eastern, you can just look up icons of Mary, okay? One of the beautiful things is, icons are funny because, I don't know if you've ever heard this about icons, because I love icons, so forgive me for going off on this, but icons are really terrible at realism, right? So like icons, they're not meant to be perspectival or like whatever. And the best argument for that, I don't know if you've ever heard this. Sorry, again, I've had too much coffee, so whatever. But the best argument is, in Western art, post-Giotto and the Renaissance and the pre-Renaissance, it's all about perspective, but from the point of the viewer of the painting. So you want perspective to be right with regard to the painting as if it was what you were seeing in real life, right? And so hence the old, if you ever took an art class, You do the train tracks, receding into the distance, and they end at the point that's right in front of your eyes, okay? For icons, a lot of people from our Western tradition will say, you guys really stink at perspective. Like, grow up, would you learn a little bit of perspective? And they say, we know how to do perspective. The point of an icon, though, is not your sight of the icon. It's the icon's sight of you. It's not meant to be proper perspective from our perspective. Because guess what? You're seeing before you ever see. That's why there's no perspective. Still today. Okay? It's not like they were hiding during the Renaissance or something. It's not like they don't, Okay, now I say that because that's one of the things that you notice in icons of Mary, is one of the most famous icons of the Theotokos is not Mary holding Jesus, like in our common, he's not even there, but you know what I mean, okay. Thank you, over there. It's actually an icon of Mary with Jesus in her womb, but it's transparent. So literally there's almost like a circle around Jesus that's meant to be the womb, and it literally looks like a magnifying glass. I mean, that's what's amazing, right? So Google Theotokos or Mary icons, from the East. So they, in some sense, I want just to finish this off. I mean, I think they have an equally high doctrine and devotion to Mary as we do, but I do tend to think that sometimes it's expressed even more so in their art and liturgy, more directly. Let's put it that way. Does that make sense? I mean, that's not too much to say, I hope, but yeah. And that changes, I think, with Raphael. I mean, if you love, I love Raphael, okay? Look up Raphael's Madonnas. He made dozens of these things, and they're all different, and they're all super cool. Some of them are really weird. Sometimes Jesus is stepping on a bird, sometimes he's holding a pomegranate, there's all these weird things, but Raphael is so beautiful to get you to see the humanity of Jesus and Mary as a mom and a baby, Whereas in the East, their icons are meant to articulate everything that we said today. They're meant that when you look at it, you see Mary is the access to the altar. She is the magnifying glass. She is the new Eve that stands there at the foot of the altar, etc., in a way that maybe is not so direct for us. So, yeah, please.
I found it very interesting, the notion of her quotation. That was the only time they had quoted her. I'm thinking about the Gospel of Mary. Is that Gnostic teaching?
Right.
Does the church, did they ever analyze any of that and think, was that in the Gospel of Mary or?
Right. That's a great point because, there's also the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, there's all these other sort of spurious documents. One thing to know, okay, is this was a really big thing. Probably, was it back in the 90s? All these books were being written, and maybe the 2000s, the lost gospels that were hidden from us, by the church, and all of this sort of controversy. And then, of course, Dan Brown followed on the heels of that and everything. Okay, fine. One of the things to know is that, when you think about why was it that the four gospels were put into the canon of Scripture, our Bible, and not the Gospel of Mary Magdalene or the Gospel of Judas or whatever, or the Gospel of Mary fragments that are there. It's not only because they're weird, because they are very weird, and I'll talk about that in a second, but it's also because they were written in the 3rd and 4th centuries. They're actually quite old. And so one of the things that is a necessity for being included in the New Testament, in the Bible, for the church, when it's sort of discerning these texts, is actually proximity to witness. Does that make sense? It can't be something that was hearsay, the game of telephone for 2 centuries, and then, no, it's really important. And in fact, John was there, Luke traveled around with Paul, Matthew was there, and Mark was the best friend of Peter. Okay? So even Peter, or Mark and Luke, who weren't there, have irrefutable ties to those that were. You see, so that's just to say. Okay, now, so I think a lot of that, hidden gospel thing is a red herring, because actually, if you read someone like Irenaeus, who's writing in like circa 180. He knows all these texts. They've been around. And he thinks they're bunk, because they are, at least the ones that were written in the 2nd century. Okay. My dissertation director did a lot of work on one Gnostic text that was called the Apocryphon of John. Okay. And he and I did some work together on the Gospel of Judas, which, if you remember, that made headlines in this period too, because the Gospel of Judas, it was one of the first, it was like a full manuscript that was found and everything. If you're in a good spiritual place and you're pretty confident, whatever, in your love of Jesus, I would recommend not taking hearsay for what these Gospels articulate, but go read a little bit of them yourselves. You will be shocked at what is in there. It is some of the most disturbing stuff you will ever read. I mean, honestly, and I'll relay. I won't relay because we are what we are. But the Gospel of Judas is absolutely, satanic beyond belief. And anyone that wants to hear, I'll be happy to relay it personally. How it reads into the crucifixion. Okay, the sort of it's a complete emptying out of Christ's work in person. But I will say, when you read the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, the fragments of all these others, whatever, it doesn't take much to see how different they are from the Gospels. And I think that's part of the problem, is that many of us do have an instinct for this, and we don't need to take hearsay of those who think that this is a new discovery, because in fact a lot of the church fathers knew about these documents and thought, okay, these are kind of crazy, whatever. So anyway, that's not to give a fully satisfying answer, but yeah. One document, if you ever want to read it, that is not this way. It's not a Gnostic gospel. It's called the Proto-Evangelion of James. And it was deliberately, it's sort of like other early Christian texts that are not Gnostic and freaky, but it's also not one that was decided to be included in the New Testament. The Proto-Evangelion of James. In there, you get a lot of interesting things. Okay, so can I tell you one story from that? This is not canonical, so this is not something that we believe is the inspired word of God, but you also don't have to not believe it, okay? So this is sort of interesting. And in fact, a lot of church fathers did think that the things related in the Proto-Evangelion of John was true. Okay, and I might be getting this wrong, so read it yourself and look it up, but there was something like this, where when Joseph and Mary were working out the controversies that surrounded her conception, because remember, Joseph wanted to put her away and all this kind of stuff, one of the things that happened, I think, and again, I'm fuzzy on this, but one of the high priests, or one of the people associated with the temple, or the synagogue in Nazareth, wanted to actually test Mary's virginity. Okay? You see, this sort of natural, this would happen a lot, right? Whatever. Well, the story goes, one of the stories, and again, this is really interesting, that as the midwife approached Mary, she touches Mary's leg and either drops over dead or is paralyzed. Okay. Why? What other biblical story had someone touch something and fall over dead?
The ark, touching the Ark of the Covenant.
Touching the Ark of the Covenant. Fascinating, right? Okay, not something we have to, it's sort of like this lower T tradition kind of thing that gets passed down, but that was written in the 2nd century. So people are thinking, this sort of has been inherited. So isn't that cool? So there are some texts like that are, maybe include stories but are not Gnostic per se, and that would be one of them. But so. Yeah. Did you? Yeah, please. Yeah.
I think it's Pope Benedict who, in one of his writings, makes the point that Christ breaks down the division conceptually between, in reality, between eternal time and temporal time, the spiritual and the material. And I was finding that your comments about Christ is present now is, in my mind, I think that very related to Benedict's in insight that I think it was in the book on the liturgy, that he developed this. And I find it helpful in kind of conceptualizing the reality of that what happens at the Eucharist is no different than what happened in reality 2,000 years ago. It's all one time. And I think that's where, in one of the scriptures, Christ, toward the end of the church year here, you know, God will be all in one. In Christ we will be all in one body, in one time, present.
That's so beautiful. Eternity and time touching. We access eternity in time through the sacraments, but also, this was always kind of the point anyway, you know, is that time and eternity would become consummated into one, you know, as it were, right? And maybe just a couple thoughts on that, because you're right, Ratzinger, Benedict, in the Spirit of the Liturgy, those sections are absolutely beautiful. You know, in the ancient world, when people thought about the capacity for memory, to remember things, that was considered a mark of our divinity, okay? Spark of divinity, as it were, within the pagan, you know, sort of whatever. And even in like an Aristotelian sense, and like Augustine talks a lot about this, in a Platonic sense, like your memory is the way that you transcend space and time. So even if it's not your divinity, it's still a way, because think about it, right? Dogs have limited sense memory, okay? Like sensual memory. But as you go up in the scale of being, like there's nothing like really human memory. I mean, it's sort of amazing, actually. And I think that the way that the ancients in large part saw this was, we are not locked into one moment after another. This repeated succession of goldfish-like events, you know, we're just like, okay, you know, whatever. No, and in fact, did you ever think about this? Augustine's Confessions is great on this. Would human relationships be possible without memory? Think about that movie, what is it, 51st Dates or 41st Dates, you know, where you're just sort of, and then think about, there was a talk I gave for years on the Eucharist and memory, and for those of us that have had loved ones struggling with Alzheimer's or dementia, right, it's so difficult. And I think we have to understand why it's so difficult, namely that Alzheimer's and dementia in a unique way undercuts relationships. Do you know what I mean? You don't, in other words, like our relationships are built on me knowing who my wife was 5 years ago, 3 years ago, a month ago, yesterday, today. You know? So it's hard when that breaks down. It's a unique form of effects in the fallen world, I think, of our sin is dementia and Alzheimer's, and you could sort of write a book on that, you know. But memory, think about that. In a way, I really do I can be with my grandmother in my memory, who I loved so dearly. I can bring those memories to me. The problem is I can't bring her to me. That's the problem. When Jewish folks celebrate the Passover, okay, I don't know if you've ever been to a Seder or you know, a Passover meal, but when they're reading the account of Exodus, do you know what they say? And I'm going to botch it. They say, when we were liberated from Egypt, when we were liberated, no one in that room was liberated from Pharaoh in Egypt. Right? But what they're saying is that in remembering the Passover, they are making present in the moment that very act of freedom and liberation. So in some sense, at every Passover, this is like Jewish teaching, you are not just remembering it as a past event. You are meant to take it as you are present there. You're part of those moving through the Red Sea. You're part of it, right? Now, this is why the Eucharist is a fulfillment of Passover, right? Because what we're suggesting is, it's not even that. It's not even that you're meant to take it in prayer like you're there, right? Jesus really is here in remembrance. We remember Jesus. And he shows up. I mean, that's unbelievable. So that is the the articulation that not only is our memory an echo of the way that we transcend the limitations of space and time, the Eucharist is now the articulation that, in fact, space and time has been invaded by eternity, definitively, you know? I mean, it's sort of beautiful. And so yeah, just to say all of that, I think that do this in memory of me, that's a form of memory come real that gives us such insane hope, because guess what? I mean, this is sort of what I was trying to say before, like, if we remember Jesus and he becomes present here, then those that we remember in Christ, the ones that we love, the saints that we love, in some sense, they are present here too. I mean, this is the communion of the saints, right? This is like what it is. So when we come, when Jesus is made present on this altar, it's not a figurative thing, right? It's not a symbol. The angels are here. The saints are here. Our loved ones are here. Everybody's here. And have you ever heard that phrase, I'll see you in the Eucharist, when you're parting with someone? Right? It's a literal form of articulating belief in this point, you know, that even though I can't see you literally, I will see you in some sense literally, because I literally receive Christ and am communing with Christ. That then, think about that experience, but without the limitations that we have of space and time in this in-between mode. There you have heaven. That's heaven. Perfect communion with God, perfect communion with one another in a non-competitive way, in a way that we won't need our memories because all will be present to all. So it's not that our memories fall away, it's that our memory is fulfilled in the same way that the Ark of the Covenant is fulfilled and the temple is full, you know, etc. So sorry for going on, but the Ratzinger thing is so beautiful on this. But our memories really are an avenue into eternity, and Jesus in the sacrament of the Eucharist capitalizes on that avenue and comes to us through it. Yeah.
How do we convince the kids that the Eucharist, you know, that it's so important to be at Mass? I mean, it's such a challenge to...
It really is. Yeah.
Yes.
My wife just gave a talk on, and she's a much better speaker than I am. She gave a talk on family life in the Eucharist, and it was this very point. You know, how do you know, whatever. And do you know that I think it's JP2 and Francis, they both say in Familiaris Consortio and Amoris Laetitia, they say that the Eucharist is the soul of the family. Isn't that kind of insane? Like, it's like the animating principle of the family, because we learn how to love here. We learn how to love each other. This is my body given for you, right? You give everything for the other. And that's the only way that you can live family life, is with that grace, because it's sort of, it can be terrible at times, you know, what it has to be, okay? Now, one of the first things that Michelle talked about was that we can maybe undersell the category of witness in us. Like, in other words, like, if you want your kids to come to Mass, or you want your little kids to be reverent at Mass, or you want your little kids to understand, like, be as you wish them to be. That's the first thing, you know? And instead of talking all the time at them, there can be a trust in the witness. You know, that's the first, and the church has all these steps for evangelization, and that's the first one. That evangelization can't happen without witness first. You know, then it needs to sort of move along. But you know, the Eucharist, I think, in so many ways, another principle, at least with little ones, is that we as a parish community, in order to be welcoming of our own children, which in many cases are either parents or little ones or teenagers or whatever, like, how are we as a parish welcoming those families into Mass, right? Not in a way that, like, if you don't take your baby out after screaming for 20 minutes into the narthex, like, there's a line there, right? But however, This has happened to me in my family. Like I have gotten all kinds of negative feelings from parishioners when I bring my family to some place. You know what I mean? And if you see a family that's on the brink of losing it in Mass, right? And therefore you're on the brink of losing it, okay, and you feel like there's one last straw, to you just freaking out, right? There might be one last straw for them to not coming anymore. And the negative feeling that you give might be that final straw for them, Now, do families need to be respectful? Do they need to be, yeah, of course, But sometimes we can default too much to words instead of witness, and then also what we think they should already know, or what we think they should already be sort of sensitive to, when in reality, like, families are some of the most vulnerable and needy portions of our community, physically, emotionally, spiritually, so on and so forth. So Francis has a great line. He says, we need to make sure that in every facet of our lives, we treat families as an opportunity and not a problem. He says this over and over again, which I think is a great examen of conscience for a parish, whatever. But I think personally too, I think the other thing is, I think the only way that the Eucharist and the attendance at Mass, especially for little ones and things like that, like, it does also need to be anchored somehow in the home. And so I think whether it's the family rosary, like, my favorite thing is always to actually have a little altar in your house, that you can gather around and pray at and things like that. Catechesis of the Good Shepherd has a ton of great resources on this. And so, like, what my wife does is she'll change the cloth on this little model altar with every liturgical season, right? And so, like, my son, who's 4, every time that we changed the cloth, like, he was super excited to go see if the priest had purple, just like we had just changed the altar cloth to purple, like, whatever. So there are anchors that you can sort of give, but it can't be just something that is, in your witness, a struggle to go to on Sundays or whatever, that kind of thing. And then finally, the other thing I'll say, that part of welcoming families is, the church, like, it doesn't just need families because it needs more donations, more faith formation participants, more, whatever. It needs families because families are a witness to the Trinitarian God and the love of the Trinity in a way that nothing else is, to be honest, Male and female, he created them, right? And children are just the outcome of male and female love, right? I mean, in a way. So the fruitfulness of that love. And that's the church's vision, is that a family, for all of its ridiculousness and insanity, familial love is somehow a sign of the love of the Trinity. And we can talk about what that is, what that even means. But part of it is, like, you can't be in a family and not sacrifice. Put the other first. It's amazing. It's amazing. And that's why wounds in families are so tragic. Not just because wounds occur, but because those wounds occur in light of what could and should be. If you're not loved by your mother, it's not just like, oh well, whatever. No, you have a right to be loved by your mother, because that's, the family fabric is one of love and of pouring oneself out, and to believe that in the pouring oneself out, you will find your happiness. It's in losing life that you gain it, And families do that in a way that others don't. So, I don't know. So if I sound harsh on the parish community, I just feel like I'm dropping in and then leaving again. I can say these things and then not, get flack like maybe Father Wood or whatever. But I do think it's a challenge. It's a challenge, and to put yourself in the shoes of. And then, one practical thing: if a family does need to be spoken to about behavior at Mass or anything else, don't do it right after Mass if they've made you angry. Do you know what I mean? Because that's what's happened to my family, and it just does not. I've never seen it go well. Like, this is a principle of, like, marital communication and also with children. Pick a neutral moment, right? If you're really angry with your spouse, don't, take a walk, whatever, eat a cheeseburger, and then go, in a neutral moment. And I mean, unless it's something that needs to be hashed out, so. anyway, neutral women, or go through a family that you know that family knows. Go through friendships or whatever else, I don't know. That may not be really answering your questions, but those are just some thoughts. So. Thank you for the time. This has been a really long time, so I'm very grateful. But yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, and I'll be happy to talk more. So.